Hi everybody, welcome to this episode of Wine Terroir, and this episode is my first time with a guest.
Hello.
Please welcome Matthew Gaughan, and he has a podcast called Matthew's World of Wine and Drink. And I'll put a link into that, so if you guys want to actually check that out, you can take a look. Today he's going to talk to us a little bit about South African Chenin Blanc, which is something that's near and dear to his heart.
Yeah, I was in South Africa just at the end of last year in November. That's my second time there, and I find South Africa an extremely fascinating country. It's exciting and dynamic, but also lots of challenges for South Africa, mainly because of its economy. South Africans are rightly proud of their heritage in winemaking. It goes all the way back to the 1600s. And in the 19th century, Constantia was one of the famous sweet wines of the world, mentioned by Jane Austen and Dickens, and is considered one of the great wines, the first outside of Europe to really have that reputation. But in the 20th century, South Africa really suffered because of apartheid, really bad economy, isolationism, protectionism. Farmers were paid a fixed price for their grapes, so there was no incentive for quality, and so the quality of South African wine really declined. But with the fall of apartheid and the opening up of democracy, South African wine has come into the national spotlight again. Quality is much higher. But one difficulty for South Africa is that their reputation is based on inexpensive wines. And that's what people really associate South Africa with. So what producers now are trying to do is change people's perception of South African wine into the much higher quality and more expensive wines. And it's difficult because the South African economy is poor. South Africans are not wealthy, and so they don't want to spend too much on wine. And it's very difficult for the South African wine industry to invest because they don't have the money, because they don't have the revenues coming in from the wine. So it's challenging but exciting at the same time because producers are determined to make really high quality wine. And one of the focuses is Chenin Blanc, which we're going to look at in this episode. And Chenin Blanc is the most widely planted grape variety in South Africa. In fact, there's more Chenin Blanc in South Africa than the rest of the world put together.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's really a high concentration of plantings. And those plantings were mainly for inexpensive wine or for brandy, so there was no real focus on quality for Chenin Blanc. It grows in the warm conditions, keeps the acidity, but makes quite simple wines. The exception there is when the vines are old. And this is a good example of how vines that have been neglected and were never really considered for quality production can actually make amazing wine once they've matured. You see the same with Carignan in Chile or Zinfandel in California, Gamay as well. And so much higher quality with these old vines. And these vines have always been dry farmed, so there's no irrigation.
Is it illegal, or is it just the culture?
Just the culture, yeah. Remembering that irrigation, as we know it now, only really came into effect in the 1970s. So before then, dry farming was just standard practice. And that makes the vines dig their roots very deep, looking for water and nutrients. And it means that the flavours become very concentrated because the vines are working hard to produce fruit. So we're going to look at two examples of Chenin Blanc from South Africa where the vines have some age to them. So one of the things also that South African producers are really trying to emphasize is the regionality of South Africa. It's not just one monolithic winemaking culture. Soils vary, and also the climate varies as well according to the influence of the ocean or altitude or the valleys as well, trapping cooler air. So there's lots of different styles of wine being made according to the region, and that's something that South African producers are really exploring, whereas previously in the 20th century grapes were just being planted regardless of the terroir.
Was there a loss of the terroir, the knowledge, because they've been growing grapes for 400 or 500 years? Is there some known sites that are just guaranteed to be good for things like Chenin Blanc, or is that something that they're just trying to refigure out now?
They're trying to figure it out again. That was something that was lost. So for example, in the really hot inland areas, we're going to look at one of those. A lot of Chenin Blanc was planted for inexpensive, fairly sweet wine, and those areas were completely inappropriate for white wine making. And so they're really trying to reconfigure what they're planting. A good example of this is an area called Tulbagh, which is about 45 minutes from Cape Town and has some coastal influence, but it's pretty hot. And that, until the last 10-20 years, was solely for white wine production. And now they're replanting to grapes like Shiraz or Syrah, depending on what they want to call it.
Just ripping out and planting new, or grafting?
Or grafting, yeah. Also working out pinotage as well, which soils pinotage works on. Pinotage has a very bad reputation, but that's slightly undeserved. It's a difficult grape to work with, but if you're planting pinotage on the wrong soils and not using the right winemaking techniques, then it becomes a fairly bad wine, but that's the standard case for most grape varieties. So planting on difficult, infertile soils, picking at the right time, careful winemaking can make very good quality pinotage. So they're relearning the terroir, the land, but also how to work with the grape varieties.
So during the kind of like shutdown or isolationism of South Africa, were a lot of the old vines ripped out, and are they just starting to be replanted now, or there's stuff that was just abandoned, like some parts?
Yeah, stuff
of Europe?
Stuff that was abandoned, just left alone. Ironically, neglecting the vines actually helps the quality go up because they haven't been overworked in the past. So it's revisiting those old vines. That's certainly a part of it. And then a good example of that is Grenache. Grenache in South Africa is absolutely fantastic. As you can imagine, Rhone varieties really work well in South Africa, very similar climate. There's only about 10 or 11 hectares left of old vine Grenache. And because people just weren't concentrating on that quality variety. And so what producers are doing, if they have access to old vine Grenache, then fantastic, only really a limited amount. And so producers realise that Grenache does work in this environment, so they're replanting new vine Grenache, but using the old techniques that worked in the past. So using the past to kind of go towards into the future.
And in terms of some of the larger companies there, are they doing things similar to what you're seeing in Napa, where they have, kind of like mass market wines, but then I've also started focusing on some like really high-end cuvées that are either specific vineyard sites, and is it really they're staying in the mass market, and then just these smaller family-owned properties are starting to do the quality stuff?
I think it's more the smaller producers are focusing on the quality. Stellenbosch is a good comparison to Napa. It has the same kind of tasting room culture, very beautiful valley, and very high-end Bordeaux blends. And those are going to be larger companies, but still not massive corporate brands.
So not as much, and the cooperative and things like that is not really working anymore, or is it still functional?
So if you go to somewhere like Paarl, which again is another region which has a long winemaking history, that's where a lot of the bigger producers are, and the quality there I don't think is very high.
Okay.
But when you go to Swartland, which is right next to Paarl, there's a lot of smaller producers who are producing really high quality stuff.
And overall, what has drawn you to South Africa? Because it's not the first time we've talked about South Africa together. Obviously, first time we're making a show about it. But as a person who's very knowledgeable about all aspects of the wine industry, what is it that kind of like draws you near and really gets you excited about South Africa?
I think it's because I went twice in a year. And so the first time was very interesting and I learned a lot, and it's fascinating to see how South Africa is really trying to emerge from the difficult 20th century, not just in wine terms but politically and economically. And then revisiting a year later just allowed me to explore the regions even more deeply. So that's really interesting. And it's just, how does South Africa convince the world that it makes high quality wine? And I think there's a lot of wine regions in the world which have the same challenges. I think Australia is another country which makes fantastic wine, but a lot of consumers, especially here in the US, don't realize that and don't appreciate that.
Kind of tarnished the reputation as the styles have changed, or as the palate of the people drinking has changed.
Yeah, so a lot of countries have these challenges of persuading consumers that wine is high quality, but South Africa has that extra challenge because of its economic difficulties. So it's something that I want to support in a way, help these producers, because they're trying very hard, and some of the wine they're making is fantastic.
But hopefully with that economic situation, there's probably a really good value to the money ratio with these wines.
This is kind of the paradox. As a consumer, the price of South African wine is fantastic. Being able to go into a shop and buy really good South African wine for 15 to 20 US dollars, it's like, wow, good for us. But for South African producers, that just makes it so hard for them, because how do they invest? How do they get better if the money isn't coming in? So the wines should be more expensive than they are. And that's the paradox. I don't want them to be, but for the good of the South African wine industry, they do need to.
But as they gain popularity, that should change some of that.
I think so. And one of the wines we're going to look at is quite expensive, and it's highly sought after. The producer is Sadi, and these are wines that knowledgeable, wealthy consumers are willing to spend money on, and hopefully that will kind of draw other South African wines along with them. We've got two Chenin Blancs, and one is fairly inexpensive, it's about $15, and then the other is $50, so contrast in price. The first one is from Terroir, which is about 3 hours drive north of Cape Town. So Cape Town's kind of like San Francisco, similar climate, and then all the wine regions kind of branch out from Cape Town. And this is one of the more remote regions. I went visited this winery, and we were just driving along, lost internet connection completely. The road turned into a dirt track, and we were just driving. Our petrol was getting lower and lower. We were just like, where on earth is this place? And so
Hopefully they have a gas station.
right. So it's about 10-15 kilometer dirt track. Eventually there's a sign, tiny sign saying Terhoek this way. And it's a farm, an old farm, just below a mountain. Terhoek means leopard's corner, and there are leopards on the property. Also, other animals. Animals are a big pest in South Africa. There's baboons who eat the Mourvedre grapes. They have very good taste. They also like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in other areas, and they're very difficult to kind of stop them eating the grapes. They just maraud through the vineyards. Also, deer will leap onto the property, even though they have fences. They'll leap over them and eat the buds and the shoots. There's also rock rabbits on the property, which will scoot along the vines and eat the buds and the shoots as well. So lots of pests, natural animals that they have to deal with. The leopard's actually fine; it doesn't get involved in the grapes.
So this Terhoek that's the name of the winery.
Yeah.
And it just says South Africa, and maybe it says something else on
yes,
here.
it says Pinez Kloof.
And that's the appellation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's north of Swartland. And they bought this farm in the early 2000s. And unfortunately, it's a husband and wife, and the husband died not that long after they planted. But there were old vines on the property, and now the lady runs it by herself with a farmer helping her.
So roughly how old are these vines?
So it's a mixture of the ones that they planted in the early 2000s, but also Chenin Blanc, which was planted in 1976.
Okay.
So going back 40 odd years.
And from your tasting, like how old do the vines have to be for Chenin Blanc to start to get really interesting?
I think the 70s is as young as you're looking for. The one that we're going to taste next is from the 40s or the 50s.
Okay.
And that's when it gets really, really interesting.
Okay. All right, you want to jump into this?
Yeah. So this is actually from 2013, so it does have some age in it. That's not the latest release. When I was there, I tasted a few vintages, and it's surprising how a wine of this value can actually hold up with a little bit of age.
Yeah. No, I admit, I often say that people drink wine too young, especially if it's, a decent producer, decent price point. So his color's pretty pale. Definitely like a pale lemon. Nose is interesting. I get this like steely thing. But also like melon.
Yeah. So what you're going to get with South African Chenin Blanc is obviously going to be different from the Loire Valley. It's a very different climate, much warmer. So you're going to get fruitier aromas, more in the stone and tropical fruit aromas. The climate for this winery in particular is quite warm, but there is a cooling influence coming in from the ocean. It's only about 30 kilometers from the ocean, and the mountain that it's underneath actually protects the vines from the sunshine. So it's a really nice location to have these vines planted.
What else are you getting on the nose?
It's a little bit nutty. I think that's coming from the maturity. So with Chenin Blanc, we're going to get that waxy honeycomb.
I was going to say lanolin wax kind of thing.
So that's natural to the Chenin Blanc, and I think that develops with a little bit of age as well. And then getting the nuts from it as well.
Yeah, kind of like that, like peanut skins, peanut shells kind of thing. I get that a lot on, even on some Loire Chenin Blancs, to get that kind of nuttiness.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of it's not crazy aromatic. It's like medium intensity for me.
Yeah.
It's pretty though. It's subtle. It's not like
it's gentle and
you could tell there's like no oak really used in this. Is it? Do you know if it's neutral stainless steel? I'm assuming stainless steel.
It's going to be neutral oak, I think. It's definitely not any new oak.
Yeah, the waxy lanolin thing is really really nice. Okay.
Yeah,
what do you think?
It has
kind of dry.
Yeah, dry. Has really great. So when I was in South Africa, another producer in Swartland who makes a fantastic Chenin Blanc, it's called David and Nadia, and he says Chenin Blanc in South Africa does not have high acidity because it's a warm climate. What it has is a perception of high acidity, and I thought it was a really interesting observation because it's not highly acidic, but it has this viscous quality to it.
And then it cuts.
Yeah, so your mouth is not mouth-watering necessarily, but the wine is kind of sticking to the palate, which makes it feel refreshing.
Yeah.
So without even having the high acidity that the Loire Chenin Blanc has, it's still very refreshing. And it doesn't feel too heavy or too flabby.
Yeah, I mean, this is like medium, maybe medium plus acidity for me. I mean, I think it's, again, it's hard to separate that perception. There's definitely the alcohol seems really balanced here. What is this, like 13?
It's 14.
14. Okay, yeah. The alcohol is really balanced.
Yeah.
It's not hot at all, and
gives it a little bit of spice, which I like.
And then the weight, there is like an initial weight, but then it kind of like cuts through, and maybe that's that perception of like that fake acidity that we were referencing.
Yeah.
I really like the nose. That waxy note is really, really interesting to me.
And it's amazing value for $15 for a 5-year-old white wine.
Yeah.
It's still fresh, still fruity, still very pure to the grape variety with a little bit of maturity. And this goes back to the price point we were talking about with South Africa. This shouldn't be $15, but it is.
Yeah, and you're getting like almost like a saltiness on the finish. You're still getting like cantaloupe, melon, this kind of like white peach. Ripe, but not like super ripe. And then on the palate more than I've got on the nose. I got a little bit like pomelo, like grapefruity citrus notes on the finish or on the palate. And then the finish, I'd say medium length, but it's definitely got that really interesting like waxy, salty thing going on. That's I wouldn't have expected from the Chenin Blanc here. But yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a fun wine. They also make a Grenache, which is very nice, and a GSM, which is good as well, with the Mourvedre kind of kicking in, giving it some earthiness.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. You want to? And the next one, so Sadie family. Okay, you want to introduce it?
Yeah. So Ellen Sadi is one of the leading lights of South African wine. He also has worked in Priorat in Spain.
Yeah, he's done like more vintages than any other like winemaker because he flip flops between north and south.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a lot of hard work, but it is worth it because he makes some fantastic wine. And he invested in the Swartland about 20 years ago. And the Swartland is this kind of remote region just north of Cape Town. It means black land in Afrikaans. And there's been some fantastic wine being made here from old vines as well as new plantings as well. And there's just a clutch of really good producers exploring the terroir of Swartland.
And these are all bush vines?
So about 10 years ago, he decided to do an old vine project in Afrikaans, not a language I can speak very easily, but it's the Uvingadrix, which means the old vine project.
Okay.
So he makes an absolutely outstanding old vine Grenache, old vine Touriga Franca, and then a series of old vine Chenin Blancs.
Interesting to have Touriga Franca there.
That was for fortified wine production.
Okay.
So again, like Australia, a lot of fortified wine was made, and the Touriga Franca that he made was planted in the early 70s.
Okay.
And Portuguese varieties definitely work very well in South Africa. So the handful of wines that I tried from Portuguese varieties were really interesting, and that'd be something I'd certainly be interested in planting if you don't have access to the old vines. So this one is from Olifants River, which is inland and very warm, and in theory, there's no way you should be making world-class Chenin Blanc from such a warm climate. Alcohol is 14.5%. But it's absolutely amazing. The vines were planted, I think, in the late 1940s. And I assume it is bush vines, the old training system.
So Olifants River is its own standalone appellation?
Yes.
And has it been its own appellation for quite some time?
Yeah, so one thing about South Africa is that, unlike, again, kind of referencing Australia because it's interesting comparisons. Australia only introduced their geographical indication system because the EU made them.
Right.
Whereas South Africa introduced this in the 80s. And so they've always been very keen on their regionality, but now they're exploring it much more. So all of these geographical indications of South Africa date back quite a lot older than the Australian, New Zealand ones, for instance. So Olifants River has been its own thing, I think, from the time that the geographical indication system was created.
And so you said these are 40s and 50s?
Yeah.
Okay. And is it 100% Chenin?
100% Chenin, yeah.
Okay. Because I've had some of his others where they have a little bit of
he does
semi-owned.
Yeah, he does some crazy blends as well.
Yeah.
But the old vine stuff is all from that one vineyard. He also does one from Stellenbosch, which is the oldest Chenin Blanc vines in South Africa. They were planted around the time of the First World War, which is one of the greatest white wines I've ever tried.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely astonishing. This wine's pretty good. And then I tasted that one after it. It's like, wow. Because this is a really good wine.
Okay. So color definitely getting. What's the vintage here?
It's
2016.
2016, yeah. So it's a couple of years old. This one.
Definitely a little bit more color here. Medium lemon there. Maybe even pale gold, but yeah, this is a little bit more aromatic than the last one. The like medium plus. I'm still getting that waxy kind of like fresh candle kind of.
But what you're getting with the aromas in this wine is the intensity of the aromas. They're really concentrated.
Yes.
So it's not leaping out of the glass at you, but you're going into it and you're just getting deeper and deeper into it.
There's like layers of aromas that you're kind of getting into. What are you smelling?
Well, I'm getting the real kind of stone, mineral, steely aromas on the nose with a little bit of biscuit. I think this has some lees aging.
Yeah, definitely getting a little bit of like a little slight yogurty cheese rind going on.
Yeah. But it's not an overpoweringly fruity wine. And again, you think with this warm climate and high alcohol, this is going to be almost like a fruit bomb, but it's not. It's more about the texture of the aromas than the powerful fruit aromas.
And I'm not getting the alcohol really on the nose.
Not on the nose, no.
It's like, so it's really interesting. I think blind, I wouldn't just smelling it. I haven't tasted it yet, but I wouldn't have guessed that high of alcohol. But I am starting getting like that kind of like yellow apple, a little bit more kind of like. I don't know if it's not sweet enough to be peach necessarily. It doesn't seem, it's like almost more like quince, like kind of like those kind
quince,
of like ripe but not like super not super sweet fruits.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But that kind of waxy steely note is really interesting. I think the acidity levels here are a little bit higher.
Yeah.
So it's like for me, this is dry, medium plus acidity. I'm really impressed by the alcohol level. Like there's definitely a weight to this, but the alcohol, I would not have guessed 14.5.
No way. No way.
I mean, perception wise, this is like maybe medium plus, but even like really in check, really balanced.
Yeah.
That just speaks to his winemaking ability. The fact that the fruit can contain that alcohol.
Yeah, and again, it's those old vines. If this was new plantings at 14.5% alcohol, I think you'd really know, because the fruits would have just got ripe very, very quickly. But I think what's happened here, that fruits have obviously got ripe, but they've done so in a gradual, slow manner. So the acidity has been preserved, the fruits have just got that sugar building up gradually, so everything's in balance, everything's in check.
And he believes in like a lot of hang time on the fruit, right? He does like optimal picking,
right,
at the exact right time.
Yeah.
From what I've read about his methodologies.
Yeah, but it's amazing that freshness has been preserved with that long ripening.
Yeah.
You would think it would just be about the sugar and the fruit and the alcohol, but it's not. It's really refreshing. And again, it has that viscosity rather than that mouth-watering acidity. It's like the wine just sticking to the palate and making you want to drink more of it.
Oh, this is beautiful. I really like this.
Yeah.
And what's the price point? So you said this is $15 to $20, and what's the price point here?
It's 50.
50, okay.
Yeah. So it's obviously expensive for a South African white wine, but these wines are highly sought after. This is available at K&L. I don't know if they've sold out. I bought it a couple of months ago. You're only allowed to buy 6 bottles of this at K&L because it's very limited availability.
No, there's a texture to this wine that I think is we'd be sad not to mention. Like you mentioned it earlier on about when you were talking high level about the bottle, but there's definitely a texture where you're almost getting like you're kind of going through that like waxy, steely, but then you're hitting those kind of like yellow apples and peaches and quince and things like that. But then you're then it like kind of goes back almost to that waxiness and honeycomb, and it really kind of carries, and almost like this like chamomile tea thing on the finish as well. On the finish here, like I'm still tasting this wine.
Absolutely.
It's definitely a long finish. I'm trying to compare this. How would I? It's so unique. I don't know what I would reference this as. I mean, because for $50 price point, it may be expensive, but like if you were to spend $50 on a white wine in Burgundy, you're not going to get something that's super like even maybe in the same class as this. And this is a very and I use Burgundy as an example just because they're expensive, but the quality level here is really, really high. And in Burgundy, you're going to get something that's, decent for that money, but not necessarily the depth of fruit and layers of flavor that you get here. And that's really interesting to me. I mean, I think this is a great example in like a more of a know if you say everyday drinking wine, but this is definitely something that's and I think this could age as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think kind of building on that point, value isn't just about being inexpensive.
Right.
Value is being at the right price point for all the quality. And for $50, this is a $100 wine, basically, if not more. And if you were, as Robert says, if you were to get white Burgundy of this quality, you're easily going into the hundreds. And interesting comparison for this would be with the wines of Nicolas Joly in the Loire Valley, and they're $100, same quality. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, very different stylistically.
Yeah, very different style.
But I mean, this is almost like I'm trying to think. This would be for, like, I think a better comparison for me would be like, this is like high-end Beaujolais cru, like, bottlings. Like, this would be like Pie or these kind of like really high-end bottlings that are going for $50-$60, but it really should be $100 bottles in Beaujolais, like from the top producers. And like Old Vine, Yvan Matras, Fleury is something like that. I think about that, or Jean Foyard's Pie. Like, this is really, really high-end Old Vine concentrated, layers of flavor, and I think that I would agree with you. This is probably, value-wise, would be $100 in my mind if people knew what we're actually drinking.
Exactly.
And there's definitely a marketing aspect that has to happen. But for me, this is like, I know you hate scores, but for me, this is like 93, 94 point wine. This is like really, like, for me, I would like to see how this ages, and I'm kind of and my scoring, I'd be like, I'd want to have some more development for this, because this is still really young, but this is really good right now, and I think that this has longevity to last. This could go 20 years easily. Yeah. I mean, this is built to last.
Yeah. Yes.
These are super exciting.
Yeah.
I know a lot more now about South African Chenin Blanc. Yeah. Well, thank you for bringing these beautiful wines and joining in on this episode.
No problem. It's great to share the South African wine and what is going on in South Africa. And I think these two wines show why South Africa is an exciting country to follow, and see how it develops and how the wines get better and how people begin to appreciate them. And
so I want to give a quick shout out to Matthew's blog, podcast, as well as his Instagram. So a lot of Instagram followers can check out his Instagram feed. So it's at
Matt's Wine World on iTunes, on SoundCloud. Also have my own website, matthewsworldofwineanddrink.com, where all the podcasts are available, as well as some of my educational posts. And so you update almost weekly to your podcast? Yes. And then you release on Instagram, like every time you do a new post, you actually make a post regarding that and let people know. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so please check them out. And if you like this episode, please hit that like button at the bottom. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll get some more guests going on. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Bye.